Welcome back. We'll be continuing on page 119, looking at gestures, which has to do with our arm and hand movements. Gestures often complement the verbal message, and if you're looking through the examples there, you can just read them out in the different cultures there. We do, though, have at least 4 different kinds of gestures, which is emblems, illustrators, regulators, and adapters. Emblems are gestures that have a verbal translation. Cultures have their own emblems usually. For example, when you wave your hand as someone is leaving, it means goodbye. Or when you give the finger, it is interpreted as an insult. Of course, other cultures have their own emblems. For example, in India, a slow shaking of the slow shaking of the head means yes and not no. You might think that there are some also universal gestures, but this appears not to be true. There are a number of societies, either the Netherlands, Norway, and Switzerland, that have a no obscene gesture. And in some ways, emblems are not the easiest gestures to understand cross-culturally because they're easy to reproduce when emblems have the same meaning cross-culturally. There's no problem. So they're just saying here that is a gesture that will sort of in a way replace the verbal there. And then in terms of the universal aspect, when visiting a foreign country, you're trying to find a hotel, you will most probably to revert to a non-verbal gesture, such as showing signs of sleep to make yourself understood. In South Africa, hailing a taxi often goes along with a very specific emblem that is indicative of where you want to go. A white Afrikaans-speaking friend of one of the authors once tried to hail a taxi and was very perturbed when they all seemed to ignore her when she could not see they had space left to accommodate her. Of course, they did not stop to pick her up because of the emblem she used. Merely waving a hand did not indicate a clear indication of where she wanted to go. In the end, she caused quite a commotion of waving both arms in the air, creating a very panic-stricken impression on the oncoming taxi driver. She should have attempted to hail a taxi by doing the following: raising the arm with an index finger pointing skyward if she wanted to go to town. Extend the arm with the index point to the ground. She wanted to go to a local nearby destination. Swing the forearm downwards with an open hand from side to side. She wanted to continue traveling down the road in a straight line. Swing a closed hand, extend upwards in a circular motion. She wanted to travel to the train station. I did not know these emblems. So apparently if you use these, it'll indicate to the taxi driver where you want to go. So an emblem is just sort of a hand gesture sort of movement that's going to replace the verbal message there. And of course, it is different depending on the culture. And within the culture, you should try to get an idea of the emblems used there. In terms of illustrators, this is what's going to go along with our speech, also known as complementing the speech. When you're scolding someone, you might, shake your finger. It definitely depends on the culture, so you shouldn't always use those illustrators. But then once again, even if you're part of a culture, it's going to have individual preference of who wants to use what sort of illustrator. They say here that it's important to note the difference between African cultures and Afrikaans and English speakers is how to indicate the height of a human being. When one refers to a person's height, African cultures prefer that the finger should be pointed to the sky with the palm upward to indicate the direction of the spine. When you refer to animals' height, the fingers can be straightened with the palm downwards, also to indicate the direction of the spine or the back is growing. And then they do give a lot more examples there that you can read through of between the cultures of how they use illustrators. But for now, we're going to be moving on to regulators. Regulators you might have learned once again from Communication Science 1A, which is how we regulate the conversation to indicate it's our turn to talk. This can also be illustrating the greeting and leave taking and varies within the culture. So when we greet someone, we may shake their hand or we hug them. When we're ready to leave, we often will gather our stuff to indicate to, the person, we're ready to leave there. It's also important to note there's a unique set of regulators in each language. For example, in Japan, turn-taking is regulated more by pauses than by gestures. So that a brief pause in the conversation indicates the next person may talk. In fact, Japanese people remark that it's sometimes difficult to jump into conversations with other cultures because they are waiting for the regulating pause that never comes. So this is actually quite interesting. I think a lot of people also do this as well in other cultures as well, that if you want to take a turn to talk, you might wait for the person to stop. but they might be waiting for you to jump in. So you need to be very sensitive to the different cultural regulators there as well. And then lastly is adapters. This is what accompanies us to help us manage our emotions. So we might tap our feet or fingers when we're nervous, such as this sort of movement. We might rub our eyes when we feel like crying, clench our fists when we're angry. So it accompanies the gesture for helping our emotions there. We should be very sensitive to this as well, that everyone has different adapters. And in terms of this, I do have some examples there, such as to practice gestural humility. Assume that the familiar gestures of our home culture will not mean the same thing abroad. Don't always think that what you're doing here in your own culture is universally there as a symbol. Okay, once again, I've just included this. So once again, gestures are just movements of the body, hands, and arms. Illustrators accompany the speech. Emblems are things that can, deliberate non-verbal behaviors that stand alone and have a very precise meaning. And it's also part of our arm and hand movements. And adapters are things that accompanies our emotions. Next we have is time. Time orientation is differentiated into monochronic and polychronic. This once again goes back to your Communication Science 1A book. So monochronic is associated with English Afrikaans speaking people. Time is a commodity. Time can be gained, lost, spent, or wasted or saved. It is linear. We value punctuality, appointments, completion of tasks, and schedules. Most associated with the individualistic orientation. Whereas polychronic is time is holistic and circular. Middle East people do not start on time. People socialize during meetings. Meetings can be cancelled due to personal obligations. Tasks are accomplished because of personal relationships, and so on. So quite a bit under there. And you can read through all the examples of the different time orientations they have there on page 121. And once again, they also put you on page 122, table 6.1, the views of monochronic and polychronic workers on one or another. Because of this, a lot of people, because of how they view time, there can be misunderstandings between cultures, especially if you a Western person, you go to an Eastern land, you might understand how they view culture. You might think, okay, it's 2 o'clock, that means the boat is coming at 2. But I think here in South Africa, we do have a lot of the polychronic time orientation as well, which is that if I tell you, okay, the president's announcement is going to come on at 8 o'clock, or let's put it at 8 o'clock, you're probably going to tune in at about 10 past 8. We don't necessarily start on time all the time. And the last one is silence. Once again, varies from culture to culture. Usually in a monochronic or individualistic orientation, we would have that silence is not, it's quite an awkward thing. Maybe they say in South African context, silence is not highly valued because it symbolizes more of a negative sort of value there. But silence can be very meaningful. And I just want to point out there, what does silence mean to you in a conversation? So if someone is being silent in the conversation, what do you note that as? Do you think that's fine? If someone's being quiet towards you, how do you interpret that kind of communication? Or do you think if you're speaking to someone, they're not talking to you, then that might be a negative thing? They've noted here as well, but often examples, what does silence mean in the business context? Sometimes I think silence is the best strategy. And then it also silence in different contexts. There are a lot of different examples here. Silence in terms of a classroom and in cultural context, it really does depend on the culture. Such as I think here they say in silence in Japan has been compared to the white space in brush paintings or calligraphy scrolls. A picture is not richer, more accurate, or more complete if such spaces are filled in. To do so would be to confuse and distract from what is presented. Silence is highly valued in Japan and the Asian cultures because it's a time to reflect and to actually process analytically and more in a deepening sort of way what is being said. And then once again, they're just moving on to what does it mean in social situations. And it's quite tricky because it does depend on the culture and to be very sensitive as well to the different cultures and how they interpret silence. In our last section of the work, we'll be looking at cultural variation of stereotypes. Over here on page 123, they're just noting that the cultural variations do tend to stereotype people. As I've been discussing this, I've been saying, Asian people are like this, and European are like this, and People from Arab are like this. And this obviously means it's a generalization, it's a stereotype. So we're going to be discussing this in the next video clip.